Something very telling is happening behind the scenes with the Pittsburgh Steelers right now, and if you really pay attention to how this front office is approaching the quarterback position heading into the draft, you start to see a very specific pattern forming. One that isn't about chasing headlines, but about increasing their odds of finally finding stability at the most important position in football. Because instead of focusing only on the top names that dominate the media conversation, the Steelers are quietly exploring a completely different path. And that path starts with an old school philosophy that still carries weight inside NFL circles. Bill Parcells' 7 rules for evaluating quarterback prospects. Now, these rules are not new, they've been around for years. But what's interesting is how relevant they still are when you apply them to this current draft class. Parcells believed that for a quarterback to be considered a legitimate NFL prospect, he had to check every single one of these boxes. Be a senior, graduate college, start for at least 3 years, have 30+ starts, win at least 23 games, complete over 60% of his passes, and maintain a 2.1 touchdown to interception ratio. And when you apply that filter to this year's class, something surprising happens. Only 7 quarterbacks actually meet all 7 criteria. Drew Aller from Penn State, Carson Beck from Miami, Taylon Green from Arkansas, Cade Klubnik from Clemson, Luke Altmaier from Illinois, Baron Morton from Texas Tech, and Diego Pavaya. But here's where it gets even more interesting. None of these guys are projected to go early in the draft. In fact, most of them are expected to be day 3 picks, or not drafted at all. Now think about that for a second. The quarterbacks who check every box from a proven, time-tested evaluation system are not the ones being hyped as franchise saviors. Meanwhile, the top 3 quarterbacks on the consensus board, Fernando Mendoza, Ty Simpson, and Garrett Nussmeier, don't even meet the full criteria. That doesn't mean they'll fail, but it does raise a real question about how teams balance upside versus probability. And this is exactly where the Steelers' strategy starts to come into focus. Because when you add another layer, what the physical and athletic thresholds that NFL teams typically look for, the list shrinks even further. Minimum size, weight, hand size, and mobility standards eliminate 3 more names, leaving just 4 quarterbacks who truly fit both the production profile and the physical baseline. Drew Aller, Carson Beck, Taylon Green, and Baron Morton. And here's the key detail. The Steelers have already shown confirmed interest in 3 of them. They met with Drew Aller at the Combine. They did the same with Carson Beck, who also had a top 30 visit in Pittsburgh, and now reports indicate that Taylon Green is also scheduled for a top 30 visit. That's not random, that's targeted. It tells you the Steelers are not just scouting quarterbacks, they are filtering them through a very specific lens. They're looking for experience, efficiency, and traits that historically translate better to the NFL level. And most importantly, they're looking for value. Because let's be honest, this team is not in a position where they need to force a quarterback pick early. With a veteran presence like Aaron Rodgers potentially leading the room and a young player like Will Howard developing behind him, Pittsburgh has the flexibility to take a calculated swing instead of a desperate one. And that's where a name like Baron Morton starts to become extremely intriguing. This is a quarterback who, despite being ranked 299th on the consensus big board, brings a level of experience and production that doesn't match that draft position at all. We're talking about 45 college games, over 1,200 passing attempts, quick decision making, and one of the fastest average release times in the country last season. His mechanics are clean, his motion is repeatable, he can throw on the run, stretch the field, and stand tall in the pocket under pressure. The numbers back it up too. Strong efficiency, high yards per attempt, and one of the better big-time throw percentages in college football. And he did all of that while playing through a fractured fibula late in the season. That matters, because toughness, durability, and the ability to perform under adversity are traits that don't always show up on a stat sheet, but they absolutely show up on film. Of course, he's not a perfect prospect. There are real concerns. Injuries have followed him throughout his college career. His aggressive style can lead to risky throws, and his pocket awareness still needs development. But here's the bigger picture. On day 3 of the draft, you're not looking for perfection. You're looking for upside relative to cost. And right now, the Steelers seem to be positioning themselves to take advantage of exactly that. So when you step back and look at everything, the Parcells criteria, the athletic filters, the confirmed visits, and the potential value range, it becomes clear that Pittsburgh is not just evaluating quarterbacks. They're building a strategy around probability, development, and long-term flexibility. And the real question now becomes this: are the Steelers setting themselves up to quietly steal a quarterback late in the draft while everyone else is focused on the big names? What do you think about this approach? And if that's really the direction Pittsburgh is leaning toward, then what you're watching unfold right now is not just a draft strategy, it's a calculated shift in philosophy at the most important position on the roster. Because instead of forcing a decision early and tying the future of the franchise to one high-risk pick, the Steelers are creating layers of competition and development inside the quarterback room, and that changes everything. Think about the structure that's quietly being built here. You potentially have Aaron Rodgers as the experienced veteran presence, someone who doesn't just start games, but elevates the standard in the room, sets expectations, and becomes a real-time mentor. Then you have Will Howard, a young quarterback with physical tools and developmental upside, already fighting to prove he belongs. Now imagine adding another prospect into that mix, not as a savior, not with pressure to start immediately, but as a calculated investment. A player who fits specific criteria, who has experience, who has shown flashes on film, and who can compete without the weight of expectations. That's how you build sustainability at quarterback. And this is where the contrast with the rest of the league becomes even more interesting. Because while other teams may be reaching for traits, betting on raw upside, or falling in love with limited sample sizes, the Steelers are doing the opposite. They're prioritizing data points that have historically translated. They're leaning into experience. They're valuing efficiency, decision-making, and proven production over projection alone. It doesn't guarantee success. Nothing does at quarterback. But it does increase your margin for error, and when you look specifically at a player like Baron Morton within that context, his profile starts to make even more sense for Pittsburgh. This is a quarterback who processes quickly, gets the ball out on time, and operates efficiently within structure. All traits that translate well to an NFL offense that values timing and rhythm. His ability to push the ball downfield adds another layer, giving him legitimate playmaking upside if developed properly, but more importantly, he doesn't need to play right away. That's the key to this entire approach, because when you remove urgency, you give yourself the freedom to develop. You give coaches time to refine mechanics, improve pocket awareness, and clean up decision making without the pressure of immediate results. And for a player like Morton, or even someone like Drew Aller, if he falls into range, that environment could be the difference between a short-term backup and a long-term contributor. And let's not ignore the value element here either. If you're spending a 5th, 6th, or 7th round pick on a quarterback, the expectation is already low. Historically, most of those picks don't turn into long-term starters. But when you find one that can develop into a reliable backup, or even better, a spot starter with upside, you've already won that selection. Now, if that player exceeds expectations, that's how you find a true diamond in the rough. And based on everything laid out so far, it really does feel like the Steelers are trying to give themselves as many chances as possible to hit on one of these picks without putting themselves in a position where they have to. Because that's the real takeaway here. This isn't about one quarterback. It's about building a system where multiple options can develop, compete, and eventually separate themselves over time. And when you look at the names involved, Drew Aller with his high-end arm talent and physical tools, Carson Beck with his experience and steady production, Taylon Green with his athletic profile, and Baron Morton with his underrated efficiency and toughness, you start to see a group of prospects that all bring something different to the table. Different strengths, different risks, different developmental paths, but all fitting within the same overall vision. And that vision is patience, competition, and calculated risk. So now it really comes down to how the board falls on draft night. If a guy like Aller goes earlier than expected, do the Steelers pivot to value later? If Morton is sitting there in the 6th or 7th round, do they pull the trigger? And if they do, could that end up being one of the most important decisions they make in this entire draft class? Because sometimes the moves that don't make headlines right away are the ones that end up defining your future. And the deeper you go into this, the more you realize this might not just be about adding another quarterback. It might be about quietly reshaping the entire identity of how the Steelers approach the position moving forward. Because for years, this organization had stability. From Ben Roethlisberger's era, everything was built around one guy. There was no real need to develop multiple layers behind him. But ever since that era ended, you can feel the shift, the uncertainty, the constant search, the attempts to find the next answer. And instead of forcing that answer, what they're doing now feels much more deliberate. They're building a pipeline, a system where quarterbacks are brought in with specific traits, developed over time, and evaluated within a competitive environment, not rushed, not handed anything, but forced to earn their place. And that kind of structure only works if you commit to it fully. Which brings us back to what we're seeing in this draft cycle. The Steelers are not chasing hype. They're not overreacting to rankings. They're not locking themselves into one name. They're casting a wider net, but it's a filtered net. Every name connected to them fits a certain profile. Every visit, every meeting, every reported interest follows the same pattern. That's not coincidence. That's alignment. And when a front office operates with that level of clarity, it usually means one thing. They already know what they're looking for, and more importantly, what they're willing to pass on. Now let's take that one step further. If Pittsburgh does draft one of these quarterbacks on day 3, the expectation from the outside might be minimal. Most fans will look at it as a depth move, a camp arm, a long shot. But internally, that player is stepping into a very real opportunity. Because behind the scenes, there's no guaranteed long-term answer at the position yet. There's competition, there's uncertainty, and that opens the door, even if it's just slightly, for someone to rise. We've seen it happen before in this league. Quarterbacks taken late, overlooked, undervalued, and then placed in the right system with the right coaching and enough time to develop. They start to show something, not immediately, not overnight, but gradually. And suddenly, what looked like a low-risk pick turns into a legitimate asset. That's the bet the Steelers seem willing to make. Not on certainty, but on probability, development, and structure. And if you're a fan, that should be both exciting and a little uncomfortable at the same time, because it requires patience. It requires trusting a process that doesn't deliver instant answers, but it also gives you multiple chances to get it right instead of putting everything on one roll of the dice. So as we get closer to draft night, don't just watch who the Steelers take early. Pay very close attention to what they do on day 3, because that's where this strategy could fully reveal itself. That's where a name like Morton could come off the board. That's where a calculated move for value could happen. And that's where the Steelers might quietly take a step towards solving their quarterback situation in a way that most people won't fully appreciate until much later. And if that happens, and that's exactly why this moment feels bigger than it looks on the surface, because when a team like the Pittsburgh Steelers, known for stability, patience, and long-term vision, starts aligning multiple pieces like this around one position, it usually means they're not thinking about just this season. They're thinking 2, 3, even 5 years down the line, and that's where this entire conversation comes full circle. This isn't about whether one of these quarterbacks becomes a superstar right away. It's about building a structure where the odds of eventually finding the guy increase over time, and that only works if you stay disciplined, if you trust your evaluations, and if you're willing to let development play out. Now imagine this scenario for a second. The Steelers go through this draft, and instead of forcing a quarterback early, they stick to their board. They address other needs. They build the roster, and then somewhere in the later rounds, they take their shot. Whether it's Drew Aller if he slides, or Morton sitting there as a value pick, or even another name that fits their criteria. That player comes in with zero pressure. He sits, he learns, he competes. He's in meetings with a veteran. He's working behind the scenes with coaches. He's adjusting to the speed of the NFL without being thrown into the fire